Next up, we have a close friend of the BlockDown family. Many speakers here have joined us on the virtual events in the past. So we're very, very happy to welcome back the CEO of Radix Network, Pierce Ridyard. Please welcome Pierce to the stage.
Hey everyone, great to be here. So my name is Pierce Ridyard. I am the CEO of RDX Works, which is the core developer of the Radix protocol. Radix is a layer 1 network specifically focused on decentralized finance and bringing decentralized finance into the mainstream. So this first part of this talk is going to be about DeFi hacks and industrial revolutions. The industrial revolutions bit is a bit more subtle. So most people today think the biggest problem with DeFi is scalability. People are continually talking about how hard it is to get users, how hard it is to get your money into things because of scalability. But actually, if you look at the numbers, scalability isn't the main problem. Most people are wrong about this. It is certainly a big problem, but it's not the #1 problem in DeFi. Now, there's a lot of problems with DeFi, right? It sucks to be a developer. You're constantly battling code. You're constantly trying to avoid getting hacked. You're constantly battling against the scalability of the underlying ledgers. It sucks to be an entrepreneur. It costs millions of dollars often to get things audited to production code. And it takes years to build things with even very simple functionality underpinning it. And it sucks for users. There's high fees. It's confusing. Things like MetaMask are really hard to use for new users. And you get long transaction times. But the #1 problem with DeFi today, and I will try and convince you all of this over the course of this talk, is actually the developer experience. And how do we know that? We know that because we spent the last 3 years speaking with almost 1,000 DeFi developers in the space. And we asked them what their day looks like, what their constraints look like, what are the constraints of the project. And what we found is about 90% of developer time, if you just timed it out, was actually not spent on developing the core functionality of the application. It was spent doing things like making sure it was secure, making sure you didn't have reentrancy problems, making sure that the interfaces worked, all this kind of stuff that wasn't actually just building the functionality you wanted, but making sure that the functionality you wanted didn't do something you didn't want it to do. And the reason that it's that hard actually comes down to how you build. This is, if I went to someone and said, hey, I want a smart contract that allows you to swap one token for another, like a decentralized exchange like Uniswap. Most people would draw it like this. They go, okay, there's a trader, he comes along, he's got some tokens, he puts token A into the smart contract. Smart contract puts that into a little vault for token A. It then thinks about it, goes, okay, this is how much token B you get back, and it'll send back token B. That's how most people would draw it. This is a simplified diagram of how Uniswap works, one of the simplest smart contract DeFi applications out there. And it works like this because the way that you build on top of public ledgers is kind of insane. A token isn't just a token. A token is actually a full little program that keeps its own checks and balances of ledgers. It doesn't use the underlying ledger to work out where the token is. It actually creates its own little ledger of balances, and then you have another smart contract that has another little ledger of balances called token B, and then you have this another smart contract that does all of this message passing and error checking to make sure that these things work. And you have all of these authorizations that go via these interfaces that we know as ERC20, but what's inside it could be anything, where a lot of hacks happen. And you end up getting this sort of spaghetti code that sort of brings everything together where all of these errors can occur all of the time. And that's where we get a lot of these hacks from. And why we've had almost $2 billion of hacks this year alone. And so what does that mean, right? So DeFi capital has grown by 140 times in the last 2 years. We have 140x in capital. So clearly capital is getting into the space. Clearly users are getting into the space. In the same amount of time, we've only had 2 times developer growth. So even though capital has massively increased, the amount of funding in the space has massively increased, the number of full-time Web3 developers available has only doubled. And that is actually from a hilariously tiny base as well. We currently have about 18.5 full-time Web3 developers in the entire space. You compare that to any other language space, C#, 7.1, PHP. I mean, who uses PHP anymore? 7.3, C, C++, 7.5, Java, 9.4, Python, 11.3, JavaScript, 16.5 million. So there's about 27 million, that's their primary language if anyone thinks I'm double counting, 27 million developers in the world, and we've got 18.4 thousand in Web3, one of the best funded areas in tech at the moment. And so as a result, DeFi is growing, but it's not really thriving. We believe DeFi Web3 is going to eventually eat the entire global financial system and create the metaverse in which all of our assets and identities live, yet we're only 0.06% of global financial markets. So you can't even see us if I do us as a dot, right? Like, we've got 0.14 trillion, which is about how much is in DeFi today. It's down a bit from where it was last time I did the slide. 20 trillion if you more than 100x, but 400 trillion for the global financial system. So we're still pretty early in the space, right? So the fundamental problems come down to three areas. DeFi's not, dApps not being secure enough, developers battling code, and scale, right? I'm not saying that scale isn't a problem. And scale is a problem in a way that most people don't talk about, which is like, Solana's like, okay, 65,000 transactions per second. NASDAQ on its own does 20,000 transactions per second. And like the idea that we are anywhere near the scale that is necessary to be able to actually support the kind of applications we're talking about if this goes mass market, nothing in the space is getting even close to that. Developers battling code, as I say, that leads to a small number of developers who actually do this as their full-time job, and dApps not being secure enough makes it kind of terrifying to launch a DeFi application. So what's it going to take to make DeFi explode? Right, what needs to change for this to go from a hobbyist industry? And the answer, we believe, is revolutionize the developer experience. And the reason that we believe that is because this isn't actually the first time this has happened. There's quite a few interesting times in history that this has happened. And the most interesting one I like to talk about is the 90s. So back in the 90s, the computer game industry just started, right? And there was these incredible, prodigious developers like John Cormack, who created Doom, one of the first first-person shooter games. These guys were hailed as gods because they did feats of engineering that no one else could come close to. But that was the point. Like, no one else could come close to it. And building a game was hard. Like, making a game act like the real world was really difficult. Building a physics engine was difficult. Building a rendering engine was difficult. And these developers had to do these from scratch. And nothing worked in an intuitive way to do that. So they were spending 80 to 90% of their time building all the underlying stuff. They weren't actually spending the time making the game immersive, spending time on the artwork and the gameplay. They were spending the time building the low-level stuff that made it possible to build a computer game in the first place. And then something happened that changed everything, and that was the games engines. Most of you will probably be familiar with Unreal or Unity. And the games engines did what was necessary. They gave all of the low-level stuff that was necessary to build a game for free. The physics engines, the rendering engines, the hardware implementations, all of that stuff was given for free. And now the game designers, the game builders, could focus on building the thing that mattered, the game itself. And that meant that you flipped. You had 90% of your time could be spent on building the game. But what it also did is it lowered the barrier to entry. It made it way easier for new people to come into the industry and actually build amazing computer games. It unlocked creativity and it unlocked imagination. So as a result, gamers had more choice and there was more innovation in the space, and developers had better tools to build great things. So what happened? Games industry, 1998, $30 billion in revenue annually, globally. And then the games engine comes along and completely revolutionizes the game industry. And now we're at $173 billion per annum revenue. That is bigger than music, TV, and film combined. Now, in DeFi, that doesn't sound like big numbers, but that is pretty serious. So what will radically change the DeFi developer experience? And it's the same thing. It's going a programmable DeFi engine, something that gives you all of the primitives of Web3 and ownership and identity, all of the things that are necessary, that people spend all of their time making secure, making possible, and do for DeFi and Web3 what the game engine did for gaming. And that's essentially what Radix has done. That's our approach. Instead of taking the EVM and Solidity, we've created the Radix engine, and we've created, on top of this incredible intuitive asset-oriented programming language that allows you to leverage all of these primitives. So instead of having to write reams and reams of boilerplate code and have to deal with assets as if they're messages, you suddenly have assets like they're physical objects, and you can build something like Uniswap in a couple of hundred lines of code. And underpinning this, like Radix has been around for a long time. We started research into massively scalable public decentralized ledgers in 2013. So actually underpinning this is our ledger, which is something that we have built and validated around parallel consensus, but it's parallel consensus of these kind of applications, specifically looking at decentralized finance and being able to get to the level that was necessary to be able to do things like NASDAQ or the global financial system. That's why we call it the full stack for DeFi, and it's the only smart contract platform intentionally built to obsolete traditional finance. So how have people been liking it so far? It's still early days. We launched the programming language in December of last year, so it's been out for 5 months. And instead of integrating it immediately into the public ledger, we're doing some testing for a year with our early developer community to make sure that we're getting the language right, getting feedback and then improving the language as we go. But we're getting some great feedback, been developing on the EVM for a couple of years, discovered Radix right around the time I was getting truly sick of it, proud to be a new advocate. Using Scripto is kind of like bowling with the bumper walls, so you can't hit the gutter. Hacks, bugs, composability issues, and it's faster, easier to get a strike. And so that's essentially why we think this is in a position to uniquely solve the developer experience, because what we didn't do is we didn't start with where we are right now. We didn't start with Solidity. We didn't start with the EVM. We said that was a great prototype, but now we know what the functionality for these ledgers are. It's all around assets and ownership, so let's build that into it correctly. So the lesson that I want you to take away from this is that for us to actually grow as an industry, for us to get rid of the constraints that we have as an industry, we need to be able to bring in more developers. But those developers don't have to be the incredible god-tier developers like John Cormack at the start of Doom. They can be people that we previously were not able to bring into this space because they didn't have the requisite computer science knowledge, they didn't have the requisite understanding of consensus systems, or they didn't have the requisite understanding of formal verification. And so what we're trying to do, and what we hope that we're in the process of doing, is making Radix a place that is easier and quicker to build the next $10 billion application. And what we hope this means is this is the start of the next revolution, because what we've seen is that the start of almost every revolution is a new piece of technology that makes something radically easier to do. At the start of the Enlightenment, it was the Gutenberg printing press. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, it was the steam engine. At the start of the gaming revolution, it was the games engine. And I hope that this is something that can mean more people can get involved and help us take DeFi, take Web3 onto the mainstream. Thank you very much.